So do you want to start off by just maybe introducing yourself with your pronouns?
Totally. My name's Matthias Roberts. I go by he, him, and I'm a writer, speaker, therapist, and host the podcast Queerology.
You're busy.
I am busy.
Yeah. And you just wrote a book.
And I just wrote a book. Yeah. Yeah. Super excited.
Let's start there because I want to kind of just pick your brain about sexual ethics. So tell us a little bit about your book.
Yeah. So my book is all about sexual ethics and sexual shame, more particularly about how do we work, like for those of us who grew up in like sex negative or like purity culture kind of context where we have a lot of shame around our sexuality and sex lives. How do we work with that shame? And then how do we construct more like sex positive sexual ethics? And I really believe that sexual ethics are going to probably look different for people based on their context. So instead of writing kind of a prescriptive, here are the rules for a sex positive sexual ethic, and I feel like that would kind of be trading like purity culture for another kind of rule based system. My book is more diving into how do we think more deeply about sex and sexuality, some of the things we know from neuroscience and from psychology, and then really leaving it up to the reader to determine a sexual ethic for themselves based on kind of their answers to some of these questions or how it hits people in their bodies. So a much more expansive kind of approach to sexual ethics.
I'm loving it. I'm just hanging on every word because I think that there's way too much diversity, and I think the prescriptive way of understanding sex and anything, the prescriptive way of doing morality, I think was a way to feel safe, and in a place where, in a time when evolution was happening so rapidly, I think that people really clung to the prescriptive way of knowing that they were going to be okay, and it gave them safety. But as we watched that evolve, and maybe you share sentiments here, but that it actually became something that didn't provide safety, but it actually provided shame, for one, and a myriad of other things.
Yeah, I agree. I think in the quest for certainty, we've left out a lot of people. And it might have worked for a while for some people. I think there's always I think whenever we set on hard lines, people fall on one side or the other. But really, I think sex and sexuality is such an uncertain thing in that we can't draw boxes around it. Like it's something that I believe sexuality is fluid, and if we're working with something that's fluid, we can't really box it in very easily, and thus we need to have thinking around sexual ethics and sexuality that allows for the fluidity of it, and that's what I hope that I'm providing.
The fluidity of sexuality, I think, is maybe I'm a little biased, but in the psychology field, it's almost kind of well known from a research standpoint that sexuality can be fluid.
Absolutely.
But I think in many circles in culture, this idea of sexuality being fluid, again, really rubs against the grain of this prescriptive morality.
Right. Which scares people. Because I think when we start poking holes in certainty, when we start saying maybe the certainty isn't so certain, that is a terrifying thing.
Sure.
Because certainty does still give us a relative amount of, you said, safety. It's nice to be able to fall back on something that feels like other than ourselves. And yet, I think it's so much healthier to be able to hold a little bit of the uncertainty in our sex lives and everything.
And the fluidity. Where do you think, if it's not in the set of rules where we find safety, where do we find it?
I have a chapter about this in the book. Kind of, we have to find safety in ourselves first. I think if we're going to feel safe within our sexuality, within our sex lives, we have to start with ourselves first, and that means getting to know ourselves and working with ourselves so that we feel safe in our own bodies. Because if we don't initially feel safe with ourselves, first and foremost, we're not going to feel safe anywhere else. And of course, there are external things that we can feel as safe as we want to in our bodies, and have something happen external to us that is unsafe. So that's not to say once we're safe with ourselves, we're safe in every circumstance. But I do think it's really important to do some of the emotional work and really working through our shame stories. To kind of have a floor of safety that's established with our own selves before we jump out into the world, or as we jump out into the world, because I don't think that necessarily has to come first, because we can work on establishing that as we explore and search and find things that we like, things that we don't like. We're ever learning, but I do think that's one of the first places we can start.
Sure, absolutely.
Yeah.
It makes me think of the secure base. So when we're all toddlers, we look over our shoulder, and if mom or dad or our primary care provider are there, we crawl away or we waddle away, and we look over again. If they're still there, we keep going. The moment that secure base is gone, they're out of eyesight, we're going to pivot. We're going to get the heck back there, and we're going to be filled with fear, just total. There's a P word I'm looking for. I can't find it, but we'll be really scared. And I think that as we forge into adulthood, we almost in some way have to become our own secure base. Absolutely. Meaning we have to find our own safety. In terms of sexual ethics, what might be some components or some steps that people can really embrace that secure base in their sexual ethic and become their own safety?
I think a lot of it is learning how to trust ourselves. So when we make moves in our lives that advocate for our own selves, so for our own, whether it be protection, or pleasure, like things that benefit our own selves, which in some ways sounds a little bit selfish, and I don't necessarily mean selfishly, although I do think a sexual act when we're with other people, there's a mix of selfishness and selflessness that comes within having sex. But when we advocate for our own selves and then are able to build trust with our own selves, so for example, for me, I've been working on setting boundaries recently, and as I learn to set those boundaries and then actually make those steps of having those hard conversations with people, saying like, if this relationship's going to continue, you can't talk to me this way. Like, that's a hard conversation, but as I have those conversations, I trust myself more. And then I'm able to move more freely in the world, knowing that like I've got my own back. And it sounds like such a simple thing, and yet it's really hard to do, to be able to trust and advocate for our own selves. And I think that comes into our bedrooms, into our sex lives, over and over and over and over again, saying stop when something doesn't feel good. That's hard to do, because I think for a lot of us, it's a lot easier to just kind of let it go on for the sake of getting over that awkwardness, or the awkwardness of what that conversation would bring. And when we can do that, it opens up a whole nother world of trust and possibility.
I know for myself that there was definitely a season where alcohol was a major factor in my sex life, and in the lives of the people that I get to work with and sit with and listen to. Sex has been a major way of creating self-mistrust. Like, I can't trust myself in this area. I make really poor decisions, or I can't say no, and then I just have to do things that I don't really want to do. And in the way that I've kind of conceptualized shame, I call it the fallen trifecta. So it's look at what I just did. I told myself I would never do it again. I'm powerless. And because I just did that, I'm valueless. And because of the context I'm creating, I shouldn't like expect the life to produce what I want, so I'm worthless. But I think that powerlessness is so important. If someone were to say, I can't trust myself, what would you recommend?
I mean, I think tying that into shame, because I think these are kind of similar concepts. I don't believe we can fight shame alone. We need to do that in relationship. And I think that's also how we can learn to trust ourselves too, is if we don't have the ability to do that within ourselves, if we kind of know that, then finding people who can advocate for us on our behalf, and people who can model that for us. Finding people in our lives who do trust themselves, and then who can advocate on our behalf and kind of push us and give us modeling for. I feel like I've just said those words over and over and over again.
I love it. It's making sense.
Yeah, but bringing other people into the picture, I think, is what I'm trying to say. Because a lot of times, if we don't know how to do something, we can try and try and try and try and try to do it, but without having other people who can show us and kind of build new neural pathways, things that we literally cannot know by ourselves, it begins to form the trust and, like I said, neural pathways that will then allow us to start building that over time. So it starts with community, I think.
For sure. I think for the people who might be listening or watching, that's so important, because I think we oftentimes, we need the safety with some trustworthy people to bring them into the shame, specifically around our sex and sexuality. We can't just trust anybody with that.
Yeah, and I think that can be like with a close friend, with mentor figures, or with a good therapist. Like I really think, especially if we don't feel like we have those people in our lives who can maybe model that for us, finding a therapist, like there's no shame in going to therapy for this kind of stuff. Because talking to someone who's licensed, who's professional, who's worked through this stuff, it is just so important. And I know we're both therapists, so that may sound biased, but it I think it's so vital. Like I see my own therapist, and am continually working through this stuff, because of how important I think it is. We can never fully arrive, I think, at this. So.
For sure. We kind of talk about it as though it's a spectrum of sexual ethics. Do you kind of want to give us just a very quick overview for the people who might be hearing about this for the first time?
Can you help me understand what exactly you're asking?
Sure. Sorry. Let me back up. I'll just start all over again. How about that? So you're also helping us write for Q Christian, writing a guidebook on the spectrum of sexual ethics. So all the way from maybe, I don't know how you might define it, but from celibacy affirming all the way maybe to something like polyamory.
Yes, there's a huge spectrum, and I think something that's really important with our sexual ethics is letting there be a spectrum. So from people who are celibate, there should be just as much space for people who feel called to celibacy, as there is for people who are polyamorous, who believe that hooking up is a part of their healthy sex lives, which I think all of those things can be very healthy. And you're right, there is kind of a progression. There are some people in our worlds who truly believe, like, I don't feel like I can be in a sexual relationship and feel good about myself. And there's a healthy way for that to be expressed. There's people who want to wait until they're married to have sex, and that can be healthy. as it is for people who decide to have sex before they're married, before commitment, who that may not even be a concept of commitment or marriage. Like that's great. And then you mentioned polyamory, like multiple partners, and whether that's in a committed relationship or not. There's a lot of room in here for freedom from shame, and I believe healthy sexuality can be expressed in each of those areas, and all the other areas that I haven't mentioned.
Yeah,
it's vast.
Yeah.
So.
You know, I oftentimes wonder when we talk about spectrum about the people who might find themselves on one extreme or the other. And I'm definitely speaking in generalities, because I think there are people on either side who are very non-dualistic, who can appreciate anyone's sexual ethic for what it is. But I think when we, and again, I'm using generalities here, but sometimes on the far left, they might really bash someone on the far right for being old-fashioned or traditional or whatever it might be. But someone on the far right might really bash someone on the far left for being too liberal. And as someone who's trained as a psychotherapist, I often wonder about the role of emotion in sex. Not that it has to be there. The role of emotion in my life might be very different than my next door neighbors. I might have way more emotion than I need, and they might have way less. And that's going to affect not only the sexuality, but their establishing of sexual ethic. Do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think... Pardon the pause. I'm thinking through this. I think when we hold really strong convictions, it can be very difficult to not put that into a morality stance. And I mean, you mentioned emotions. Like, I think a lot of times, regardless of where we fall, it can be an emotional experience to run across people who don't believe the same way that we do. Because a lot of times, like, we hold our values because they work for us, because they mean something to us, and to kind of open that up and realize, like, this doesn't work the same for everyone, and then realize, like, if this is true, like, some of my thoughts might be challenged then. That is hard. That is scary. But I have sat, like, years ago, I sat in a celibacy position. Like, that is, and I was very convicted about that. Like, I will be celibate. I will be single. And I some of the impetus for this book was actually going to a QCF conference. It was Gay Christian Network back then, and seeing people hooking up and realizing, like, wait a second, like, this does not jive with what I thought a Christian sexual ethic should be. And it's taken me years to work through that. But I think we always need to be open to the reality that other people hold other values, and they can be just as valid as our own, and we can learn from other people. I've learned so much on this journey from people who've held very different values from me, and still am.
Absolutely.
And there's always that moment of kind of like of judgment of what the heck are you talking about when I'm faced with something that so deeply challenges my values, and then learning how to work with that and sit with it, and I believe we can hold on to our strongly held values and still listen and dialogue and be with other people who hold differently.
Yes.
Yeah.
A little antidote. You know, I think my best friend Michael, he's just taller than I am. Like, he's just he has a different BMI than I do, right? Like, he's just taller.
Yeah.
And he can hold more beers than I can. And if I try and keep up with the guy, I mean, he might be a little tipsy, but I'm going to be smashed.
Mm-hmm.
So I don't try and keep up with him. And I think that in the same way, we have to respect the internal, the emotional, the spiritual diversity that we all come with. If I say, for me, 2 beers is enough, and then Michael has 6, and I say, oh my God, you're an immoral being, because 2 is enough. It's like a different scale. And I think the same thing in sexual ethics. What's emotionally comfortable for one person isn't going to be for another, and that's going to be a major factor in the way that we establish sexual ethic.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Which is kind of terrifying, I think. At least for me it is, too, because that claim of, well, then what is, like, where's the certainty? Like, what can we settle on? Sure. Like, what is the right way to do sex and sexuality? And if what you just said is true, like, there is no one right way. And that's scary to accept, I think, because it leaves us having to do a lot more work, I think.
Yeah, for sure. Absolutely. Yeah. Yeah. You seem to be fascinated with this topic. I mean, obviously you wrote a book about it.
Yeah. I love it. It's so interesting. I mean, it has such a profound impact on all of our lives. And I think as I've worked with clients, as I've worked with my own life, as I've talked to friends, like, it's something that's so applicable, because I think so many of us are searching for where we've come out of a more restrictive, kind of moralistic approach to sexuality, and are wondering, like, well, what now? What do I do with this shame?
Right.
Right. It's So,
I'm trying to be really strategic at Q Christian to put out these Q chats where we're talking about things like sexual ethic and sexuality, specifically gearing up to this year's conference theme, the theme for Fort Lauderdale in 2020, which is the Great Communion.
Right.
And the Great Communion is not necessarily about the great wine and bread, but more about the great way we commune with one another as relational beings. And I think that when we look at sex and sexual ethics and the diversity, if we can sit at this metaphorical table kind of side by side one another and really respect and learn about what the mechanisms were that helped create the sexual ethic rather than the final determination, it helps us kind of, again, back to that secure base, find security and safety in what we believe, because it's comfortable for who we are.
Yeah, I agree with that. I think because if we're like this idea of security, if we're truly sitting in a secure base, then having dialogue is not a threatening thing. And I think we're always evolving with that, because I don't know if we can ever necessarily arrive at a place of when our values are challenged, we're not threatened, at least initially. But that aspect of learning to trust ourselves, and then trust, I think about this when we talk about God. Like, if God can't handle our questions, then is God really God? And I think a lot of times our security and our personal values can sit in that too. Like, if our values can't be questioned, if we can't sit with other people who have vastly different values than us, then are they really values? Like, can we actually, like, what are they? How are they serving us? And it is such an important thing to be able to do.
Yeah. As I'm listening to you, I'm thinking about, like, the 16, 17, maybe even the 22-year-old who is maybe even in some way kind of ashamed of their sexual ethic. I'm 35, and I sound old, but I'm sure a 50-year-old's like, whatever, dude. But as a 35-year-old, it's creeping up on me. I'm closer to 40 than I am 30. It's crazy. But, thinking, like, I remember when I first discovered, like, Men for Men on Craigslist. And then I had this random, like, subscription to GQ for a while, and I remember reading about Grindr for the first time. And as someone who had so much mistrust, like, I could not trust myself, because I was just so wounded and lost, and I was medicating myself with alcohol and sex, and that's a time for another story for another time. But things like Grindr actually scared the crap out of me because it was this new slippery slope that I couldn't contain.
Right.
And now, several years later, almost a decade later, feeling really, really comfortable in my sexual ethic and the evolution of it, I think that there's a part of me that questions, and I'm maybe asking you this as a therapist more than anything.
Uh-huh.
So put on your therapy hat if you don't mind.
Try.
But I think it's a common conundrum. But I think that when we finally land in a place, we say, I can respect how progressive I am, in a sense, but I'm also maybe ashamed of how far I didn't go.
Yeah.
Because if other people can enjoy a random hookup or being polyamorous, something that might be uncomfortable for me personally, is it shame holding me in this place, or is it my sexual ethic? Do you have any insight for someone who might be kind of questioning whether it's the right thing or if it's a shame-based decision, and how they might be able to distinguish?
You know, first, I think we're always in a place of becoming. So this is the kind of thing, like, that question is a question that we can explore. So we can, I think, like, take Grindr, for example. We can take little steps and explore, like, how do I feel if I download this app, if I'm on this app? Like, what does it make me feel like? And so you mentioned shame. Like, shame primarily is a turning away. So if we're on that app and we realize, like, we're turning away from parts of ourselves, or we're kind of getting flooded with like biophysiological responses, like hot face, flush of the flush of our cheeks. That is a pretty good indication that we're sitting in a place of shame.
Sure.
Whereas if it's fear, it feels different. For me, fear is just kind of more of a pressure in my chest. It can feel different for many different people. But as we pay attention to those things, that can kind of guide us, give us a little bit of a path through, and allowing ourselves to kind of become, so say we do get on the app, and we do realize, like, I'm scared of this, like, this is fear. Then can we honor our fear? Can we sit in that place and say, like, I'm really scared about this, and that's okay. I don't have to push myself further than I want to go. Like, I can tiptoe my way into this, or hold myself back and let that be all right. Can we love those parts of ourselves that are so scared? Because I think as we love those parts of ourselves, then we can move from a place of intention, which may be getting on the app and hooking up, and it may be saying, like, you know what, like, this isn't really what I want. We can go either way.
That's beautiful. I just wanted to hit the recording there, and we'll just call it good. Seriously, no, I really like this idea of, like, I'm going to just really, like, shrink it down and really paraphrase it, but, like, listening to your body is okay.
Yeah, and I think as we listen to our body, we know, I mean, sometimes we have to discover, but we can know what our shame responses are, what our fear responses are, and then distinguish between the two. And I think both of those, like, whether we're in a shame response or whether we're in a fear response, both of those need to be treated with deep kindness, with allowance, and with exploration and curiosity, because that's the only way to move past those things.
Yeah. I'm going to pivot us just for a little bit, if that's okay with you.
Yeah, great.
But I'm really excited and kind of even proud of Q Christian for kind of opening up to a dialogue about the sexual spectrum where we can live side by side, someone who might be celibacy affirming and someone who might be polyamorous, and to say that you are welcome in this space. One of the major pieces of that communication, though, or that dialogue, is the language around sex, around talking about masturbation and hooking up and Grindr and kink. Right. We talked about that on the main stage in the Denver conference. How important is language and maybe the destigmatizing of language in creating a sexual ethic?
I mean, I think it's so important. Like, I mean, there are some philosophers who argue that language is what creates our world, and if that's true, then language is of utmost importance. And so as I think about this, I think the question is, and I tried to be intentional about this in my book, and I'm certain I got things wrong. I have no doubts about it. But intentional about being more expansive with my language about how we talk about sexuality, how we talk about partner and partners, and the reality is that if we're on a spectrum, then our language has to be on a spectrum too, and that takes a lot of intentionality, a lot of learning, a lot of knowing that we're going to get things wrong when we're entering into spaces that we may not be familiar with. We probably don't have the right language for it, and so I think about it like when we're learning a language, when we're learning a new language, like we have to allow ourselves to make mistakes. Like that's the only way to learn a language is making mistake upon mistake upon mistake upon mistake, being corrected, having an open posture to being corrected, and then like letting ourselves learn from that. I think the same goes with as we enter learning how to talk about sex and sexuality in new ways, even as it evolves, because it is continually evolving. But if we're truly going to be respectful and loving of our siblings who may believe things different than we do, like that's work we have to do. It's imperative in my mind.
You just kind of struck upon like gold here, and I'm just going to pick your brain a little bit. So, I think creating this big tent that Bukola calls it, and I love that language, where everybody is welcome. Again, the celibacy affirming all the way to the polyamorous and beyond on both sides.
Right.
In your mind, from your perspective, what is the beauty of living, of wanting to be in that big tent? Why do it?
I think of it from my faith perspective, from this idea of the divine. I believe we can't box in the divine, and that God created diversity for a reason. I mean, we see it everywhere. So I believe it's an act of worship to bring in diversity and say this is what our world is. Like it is a beautiful thing. Like think about when we walk into a rainforest. I've never walked into a rainforest. I've walked into the rainforests of Washington State, which are very different from the rainforest I had in mind. But walking into a rainforest, which is some of the most diverse ecosystems on our planet, everything if it's working as it should, which a lot of them aren't because of climate change, but if they're working as they should, everything in that ecosystem is flourishing. Is designed in such a way. And I believe that it was designed in such a way that things are flourished when diversity comes. Things flourish when diversity comes together. And I think as we learn to embrace these spectrums and bring people groups together that are so diverse, whether that be around sexuality, whether that be around race and gender, letting each thing be within its own particularity, acknowledging that particularity for what it is, leads to flourishing for everyone. It's so like mind-boggling how that works, and so cool to see.
Yeah, I love that little soundbite of that. It's an act of worship. to respect the diversity and to enjoy it on purpose, you know? I got an email once from someone, and they asked, is Q Christian Fellowship still going to be a place where you hold space for the celibacy affirming? The old language was side B. And I wrote back enthusiastically and like, yes, of course, like we're all welcome. And she wrote back saying, oh, that's so sad, because that theology was so damaging to me. In other words, that sexual ethic feels like an affront to me.
Right.
As someone who's really thinking about sexual ethics, how might you respond to a person who is no longer or hasn't ever been celibacy affirming and sees that as an oppressive way of life or an oppressive theology?
You know, there's a complexity here, because on one hand, this idea of when celibacy is prescriptive, when it's something that, like a lot of churches today, will use celibacy as a prescriptive sexual ethic for LGBTQ people. I believe that's deeply damaging. And I believe celibacy can be very healthy. So we have to be able to hold those two paradoxes almost, that it can be incredibly damaging and it can be incredibly healthy, holding those things together. But I think when we have been so deeply hurt, when it's a personal story of having celibacy prescribed to us and then having that tear us apart on the inside, realizing something is wrong and yet trying and yearning for inclusion within a faith community, when our salvation hinges on whether we can hold ourselves up to this line that a lot of us can't hold ourselves up to. I mean, we even see that in Scripture, Paul talking about celibacy isn't for everyone. It can be so hard to then look at people who've chosen celibacy, and I think that's a key point. People have to choose celibacy for themselves. And we don't get to decide when people choose that, whether that's shame-based or whether it's freedom-based. Like, that's not for outside people to decide. But when it's chosen from a place where shame isn't in the equation, shame is always in the equation on all of our sexual ethics, but we can work with that. But when it's chosen from a place of freedom, then it can be healthy. So to try to wrap that up, for people who then look back on where they were before and feel the harsh sting of that pain of what a prescribed celibacy required of them, I think the bigger question is, how then can we learn to love those parts of ourselves that were hurt? We were talking about kind of having that secure base before. I think that's a pretty good indication that there's unresolved pain in our lives, that we haven't worked through the trauma of that experience. And so for me, I see that as I need to go back and start doing some work around this as I'm ready, holding those broken parts of myself, those deeply hurt parts of myself, and giving myself the care that I needed back then that I didn't get. I think as we do that, and as those parts of ourselves heal, we're then able to open ourselves up a little bit more for people who have different values than us. I mean, it's everything that we've been saying.
That's good.
It's long, slow, hard work to work with what is quite literally trauma. And healing is difficult in those areas.
Yeah. You know, one thing that just comes up here, I think that I really like the work that you're doing in holding sex and sexual ethics next to shame, because we get a lot of beautiful data, a lot of juice to help us really navigate a little bit differently. But one of the things that I believe in kind of firmly is that we can be on either side of the spectrum out of shame. We can identify as waiting until marriage, or polyamorous, or side A, side B, celibacy affirming. We can identify in under any umbrella out of shame.
Yes.
And I think that it's really important for us to talk about that, because I think in the historical language at Q Christian Fellowship, it's if you're side B, you're shameless, or excuse me, if you're side A, you're shameless, And if you're side B, you're shame-filled.
Yes.
And that might not be the case at all.
Yeah. No. I literally have 2 chapters in my book that are basically titled with those 2 things.
Nice.
Talking about our coping mechanism for shame. Shamefulness, shamelessness. And that can look so vastly different. Like, we can look like we're on opposite sides of the spectrum, and still be so full of shame, or reacting out of our shame as a way to try to cope with the shame that we feel. It can look so different in all of us, based on who we are, based on our context. And so the key in my mind is, then how do we recognize that shame for what it is, and then start moving with intention around our sex and sexuality? That may mean changing our values, and it might mean staying right where we are, but having the secure base, the security, to actually sit in that and move with intention. Right. It can look, exactly. I'm agreeing with you.
Yeah, I'm agreeing with you here that when we lose shame, it doesn't mean our behavior changes necessarily. It just means that we're motivated from a different place. We're responding to something maybe than reacting. Yeah,
exactly.
Okay, like 2 seconds. You don't have to go in depth. But if you could talk to 13-year-old Matthias about his sexual journey and the establishment of a sexual ethic, what might be something you would tell him?
I think I would tell him, like, it's okay to be exactly where you are. I mean, I look back on on that journey from 13-year-old Matthias to now, and it happened. Like, this is going to sound kind of cliche, but it happened exactly like it needed to. Because I don't want to go back and shame 13-year-old me for being where he was at. I think he was so scared and so unaware and so indoctrinated with all of these messages, and he didn't know any better. I didn't know any better. And that's okay. And then to trust that, and to know now, being where I'm at now, like, that journey happened exactly the way it needed to. In all of the pain and all of the difficult shit that it brought up. It has brought me to where I'm at, and I'm really grateful. So it's okay to be where you're at.
That's great. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Isaac.